If you know anything about me, you know that I spent a great deal of time in the 1990s, the 1990s decade. And I've been noticing a lot of trends from the 90s returning, like TV shows and movies, like music, like grunge and pop punk, the fashions, baggy clothes, chokers. I always liked the chokers when I was a kid. I don't know what that means, but I like the chokers. I'm happy to see younger people embracing some of the things that I did as a kid. Some of the things I like too is it shows me that, you know what, we're not so different. You know, but some people might tell us, that media might tell us we're different. We're so different. We're completely different. We're not so divided. We're not so different. We like baggy clothes, chokers, and Nirvana just the same as everybody else. We're in shape. Everything is cool. But here's the thing. My memories from that decade are a little bit hazy. Look, I'm old. And my memories from that decade are a little bit hazy. So I thought I'd go back through some of the most iconic parts of the decade and try to put a finer point on what is the spirit of the 90s. And that way, worst case scenario, I refresh my own memory, have some laughs, me and you just chat a little bit, and it's a fun time, you know? So here are some ideas about the 1990s. Let's go. Now, this is a crazy thing because when I started this out, I was like, I don't even know where to start with this. The first thing I think of from the 1990s is Woodstock 99 because I went and it was crazy, but I digress. Look, I was asking myself, what thing in the 90s differentiated it from any other decade? So asking myself that question, though, it brought me down 1,000 rabbit holes. We could go and talk about music, all those different genres that were kind of invented or at least became popular in the 1990s. Movies. There were some monsters. I mean, the third biggest grossing movie, Titanic, that was huge. The Matrix. Life-changing movies happened in the 1990s. Some of the greatest, most iconic films ever made. These things are being remade right now. You know what I mean? Clothing. It was kind of like a hobo, chic, almost bad style, no style. So you could consider it like that. That was a thing. Skateboarding. It was sort of skater style too, skater and raver style. But skateboarding in the 90s was huge. Huge. It became more mainstream really in that time. Like it started to build up in the 70s, 80s, and people were going, oh yeah, but it was still kind of fringe. 90s, it was like, hey, there's Tony Hawk. There are stars in the skateboarding world that people know, even if you don't skateboard. So that was big. The internet. The internet came to prominence during the 90s, the Wild West period. I mean, that was probably the biggest thing to happen for future generations, and just literally business and life in general worldwide completely changed. And we had none of that as kids, and then more of it. Like from 1990 to 1995, there were like 15% of people had the internet. And then by 95, more than 50, like 55% of people had the internet in North America. So it's a huge jump, like a 40% jump, like half the people are now on the internet. So that was cool. Now it's everybody. So all these different angles to choose from. Would you mind if I went to the trouble of asking my friends and asking myself and making a list of stuff that I thought of, and I just stopped making the list because this is going to be too long. I can't make a 10-hour video about this. Here are just a few things that my friends and myself recall off the top of our head going, hey, what do you remember from the 90s? Okay, let's start. Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Green Day, Smashing Pumpkins, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Well, we had Beavis and Butthead. We had Woodstock for concerts in 94 and 99. 2 Woodstocks. Anime for the first time. For me, it was Ninja Scroll that I saw first, which if you're under 18, you shouldn't watch it. I was under 18, and I was like, oh my God, this cartoon is crazy. Atari, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo could happen in playing recorder in school. If I didn't edit this out, I'm an idiot because that was way too long. It was way too long. You know, some other stuff that was popular in the 90s, space-based UFO cults. They were popular for some reason. Like Scientology got a lot more press, just a lot more popular. There is the Heaven's Gate cult. Did you know about these cults? These are people who just believe in some story and that's what they're going to dedicate themselves to. These people believe that the Hale-Bopp comet, which was a comet that was passing by, it was actually an alien craft coming to pick you up off of Earth. But the only way to get on it is if you unalived yourself. So it wasn't, and they're just dead. That's how it is. Realism. This was in our neck of the woods over here in Canada's. Realist movement was believing in cloning and free love. Somehow it was like a science fiction-y sort of situation, but everybody gets to, mess around with each other. Let's go. And some other spacey stuff, with them. There were lots of cults. Lots of cults, religious cults. There was a branch Davidians, that was David Koresh, and they were lit on fire by the government. Children of God, this is where it gets dark and sick. It was like there were 6 perverts, totally not cool. Sick perverts, not 6. There's more of them than 6, I think. All I'll say about that is that in the 90s, they love cults. So the 90s love cults, the 90s love music, the 90s love chokers. Moving on. The O.J. Simpson trial was big. It was dividing the country racially. This is kind of like the George Floyd thing of the 90s era, was like, white people believe he's guilty and black people don't believe he's guilty. And it's like, okay, whatever. I think over time, now that he's dead, a lot of people just believe that he's guilty. I still don't know. You got to prove it to me. You got to prove it to me, man. I don't know. I can't deny, or I actually don't know anything. I don't really care, actually. To be honest with you, like, I know people pretend to care about stuff. I am from the 90s, and I'm not going to pretend I care about stuff. There is so much to say. There is so much to say about the music, the movies, the video games, the clothes, and the world at large in the 1990s that I decided I am going to probably split this video into several videos. If I talk about I won't be able to focus. Let's put it that way. There's way too many topics. Like, there should be a video game topic, a music topic, and a clothes topic, and all of that. So, that being the place, all of this stuff, I just listed 1,000 things there could be. There was cults, there was music, there was video games. Out of everything that was there in the 90s, there's a lot to choose from. Where do I start? There was a lot to choose from in the 90s, and where do I start? So, with so many roads to choose, I figured things aren't the place to start. Things are not what makes a decade. It's what we remember for sure. It's like, oh yeah, I remember there was DVDs. But it's not things that make a decade. It's people. It's the people. The people use the things. The people remember the things. The people are affected by these things. And their mindset and worldview and all of that is changed by the things that happen, the events, the media, the technology. So I couldn't talk about the things until we talk about the people that use them. So who am I talking about? Well, first and foremost, I am talking about Generation X. You cannot talk about the 90s if you do not talk about Generation X. Now, generally, a decade is shaped by the older people who run the business and the media and all of the government, and the habits and activities of their kids. And in this case, that would have been the baby boomers were the adults, and they were the parents, and their children were Gen X. Now, you may not have heard of Gen X. You may not have heard of Gen X, right? Because they're not in the media that much these days, but We'll get to it. So there were also some other people in the 90s, of course. There were elder millennials, which were called Gen Y at the time. It's got rebranded around 2000 because the millennium, man, millennials, right? Whoa. Somebody in some marketing department was like, I'm a genius. And I guess they were, because everyone calls it millennials. But they were called Gen Y at the time. And side note, the people born between 1977 and 1983 constitute a little-known microgeneration called the Zennials. Did you ever hear of Zennials? Well, I'm doing some research on Gen X, and I found out that 1977 and 1983 were called Zennials because Zennials with an X, by the way, like xylophone. Gen X and millennial mashed together clumsily makes Xennials, and that means that they had some influences from both generations and other decades because they were kind of born at the tail end of one and at the beginning of another. Fair enough? So what about Gen X? Who are they? Since we don't hear very much about them, we mainly hear about boomers and Gen Z or Zoomers and millennials these days. But Gen X is like, they're there. Like they constitute more than $28 trillion in wealth holdings. So they must have been doing something. Like, what have they been doing? What have these Gen Xers been doing? Like, Gen Xers were born between 1965 and 1977. Now, that is not an exact science. It's not an exact science because some sources say the Gen Xers were born like 1961, early 60s, and they all the way to 1980. But generally, that's not the consensus. It's mid 60s to late 70s tops. And like I said, there's a micro generation from 77 to 83 saying these guys are, they're bi-generational, right? They're bi-generational. So whichever is true and whatever is the truth, Gen Xers are in their late 40s and 50s, maybe as old as 60s, but generally not. Late 40s and 50s now. And so they were somewhere between 14, 15 years old. Let's say they were somewhere between 15 years old and 25 years old when 1990 came around. That's the Gen Xers. And they had a kind of reputation. Like every generation, the media tells you this is what this generation's about, because like, why are we branding a generation in the first place with some name and label? It's just people. They're probably a lot like every other person who's ever on the planet. They just have different stuff. But anyway, Gen Xers were called slackers. That was one of the first ones. They're the slacker generation. They're cynics. They're lazy. They're loners. They're uninspired. They called them numb and dumb. They called them the lost generation. This is what they're telling everybody. So I don't know if you can see that maybe Zoomers were like, oh, you guys are lazy. You don't want to work. You don't want to do all this. So maybe it didn't happen as late as we think. It's not just this generation. All you Gen Xers out there who are calling Zoomers this stuff, just remember, have a memory. It's the rhetoric that the media at the time spouted constantly. They repeated it everywhere. It was like, this is the cool thing to be, as a slacker and stuff. But was that the case? Probably for some people. But to label an entire generation that way is a little bit unrealistic, probably not true. And it's possible that the boomers felt this way. They felt that Gen X didn't buy into the same things they were buying into, which is a common generational thing. But they weren't buying into the narrative that they grew up with as kids from the 40s and 50s. Because the boomers in North America, I'll venture a guess. I'm thinking it could be because they were growing up in a time of economic expansion. In North America specifically, like, it was after World War II, and there was a huge economic boom. There was a boom in technology. There was a boom in the economy. You could come straight out of high school, start working for some company on a handshake, and buy a house for like $4,000, and you get ready to rock. You get your house, you get your kids, and that's it. It wasn't go to college and be in debt there. It was just figure out how to make enough money to have a nice house in a nice neighborhood and move on. So there was that possibility for boomers at the time, and maybe that, and it's the 50s. It's this golden era. The movies and stuff too were huge. They were incredible. I recently just watched Gene Kelly Singing in the Rain, and I'm like, this is from the 50s, and this movie's a period piece about the 20s, and it's awesome. And it's a musical, and I don't like musicals, really, pretty much at all. So, and I'm like, these dudes can freaking, I don't know, they could dance better than everyone today. I don't know. Be angry, I guess. Okay, so that Gene Kelly thing aside, the boomers, they grew up in a time of economic expansion, right? So getting with the program for them had some real world value. This was a good thing for them. Let's get with the program, guys. Come on. So by 1971, that story stopped being a one-to-one reality. It's not like a thing that's never going to change no matter what time period you're in is if you can gain some skill and expertise and a network in something and work your, I was going to say a word that YouTube doesn't like, so I'll say it, work your butt off. Work your butt off in that field and help other people and raise all ships. You can see some success. But it wasn't a one-to-one reality. Economic circumstances were a little different. Like, for example, there were certain jobs and stuff stopped existing in the 90s that existed in the 50s. Certain opportunities didn't exist. Kind of like today, how a lot of opportunities that were for people 30 years ago don't exist today, because it's like, look, you can't work at the phone book factory because there isn't a phone book factory. That stopped being a thing. The internet existed and it completely wiped that out. But speaking of 90s stuff, we used to get a phone book delivered to us. I don't know who or how or why, but that was a thing. Everyone gets a phone book. It was delivered to our door. There'd be like 6 phone books for some reason. And that would be the game plan. Don't know what to tell you. And then you'd have to call at some point when you're just using the internet, like, can you just be done with the phone books? This is over. This is over. So, yeah, it wasn't a one-to-one reality back in those days. Once you were in the 70s, you're starting to get into the 70s, things changed. Things changed. And Gen X actually were a much more educated people. It became a point where far more people went to higher education institutions. They went to college, they went to university. The boomer generation didn't all do that. It was like maybe something to the realm of twice as many. Like, it was a really big jump. A really big jump. It became important to have more education, even to just get a job. So, like, it's like if you don't have the college degree or a BA or something, maybe you're not even going to start at the lowest level. So Gen X went to these higher educations. They took Psych 101. They took Philosophy 101. And they start to question everything. They were like, this can lead to some dark places, because if you question everything, you might get some answers that you don't like. And, you know, it doesn't mean that every single person from that generation's a slacker. They just wanted reasons for things a little bit more. Now, like, do this and it'll work. Okay, I'll try that. By gum. You know, they were like, okay, really? Is that for real? Or give me some data here. You know, again, a little like the Zoomers. They're like, where's the cite your sources, bruh? You know, nobody said that back in the day. And so the Gen Xers were the first to start being like, I don't believe you. I read 5 pages of a psychology book and I think I know the human mind. Okay. So that was Gen Xers. They're kind of insufferable, but anyway, whatever. Gen X were cool though. They weren't all slackers, right? A couple of Gen Xers created Google. So they're not lazy. They're not all lazy, okay? I'm painting them to be kind of like a certain way, just like the media. I grew up in the media hypnotizing realm of the 90s. That must have been what happened. So Gen X were another thing. They were the first generation to really grow up with having video game consoles in their house. Think Atari. When Atari came out, they were the little kids playing Pac-Man, playing Pong, playing Pitfall, playing all of those Atari games back in the day. So they could play these at home though, not just going to an arcade. The boomers did go to some arcades and stuff, but these guys could just wake up and start playing it, right? So rather than going outside to play, you might spend more time at home just playing video games. You could just use your hands and brains. So again, becoming a more cerebral sort of a situation rather than thinking of going out as playing. That would have been the first generation to do that. Gen X. Let's not forget Gen X, guys. Don't sleep on Gen X. They were doing all this stuff. Like, they were probably the first to be wildly addicted to games, right? You know, everybody's wildly addicted to everything screen-based. They were the first. Not to mention they had a lot more TV. They watched twice as much TV as their parents. So, like, these guys they also were called the MTV generation, by the way. Like, the quick videos, the quick stuff. They were worried that Gen Xers were having a short attention span. They were going to be stupid, dumb morons with no brains, totally stupid, staring at the TV like zombies. And that never happened even once. I don't know. I think actually everything I know is from TV. I'm not a Gen Xer, but so yeah. Anyway, Gen X, their worldview might have been somewhat molded by this and by their parents not understanding some of this. That could be part of it. And the 90s saw an economic downturn. Let's not forget about that. So it wasn't that economic boom of the 50s, while the 90s had an economic downturn. And from 1990 to 1991, just like that first year, 1.5 million jobs in the United States gone. Right? A lot of globalization, a lot of stuff going overseas, a lot of factories, car factories and stuff disappearing. And so the one thing that was in your town that had 10,000 jobs in it, gone. Doesn't exist. You have no training in anything else. Good luck. Good luck. And doesn't that kind of feel like how some things are happening today too? The more I think about this, the more research I did, the more I was like, I don't think things are that different. I don't think anything is all that different, is it? But that's up to you to make your judgments on it. But it was interesting. So this economic downturn, and it left Gen X, who were in their teens and 20s by that time, they were feeling like the good times were over. They were feeling like they were going to have to suffer for what their parents did. Their parents got to succeed, and their parents don't understand why they're not succeeding necessarily. Not that that's every Gen Xer, but a lot of Gen Xers felt that way. Like they're 25, there's no factory job or whatever, and they went to school and there's no jobs. So they paid for college, they got to pay back the loan, and there's no jobs. That's what Gen X was going for in the 90s. How fun? How fun was that? But look, I did come across various news reports interviewing multiple Gen Xers so I could actually hear what Gen Xers had to say. They're all from various walks of life. So some of them were out there making new technologies and going forward, and things were going great. Others were losing their job at the factory. So it's not a black and white situation. It's definitely got shades of gray. So I'm not making any definite statement about this is the state of the world at the time. There was some great stuff happening and some not so great stuff happening. But it might have given you a look into the mindset of a Gen Xer going like, ooh, I'm going to have to really step it up if I want to get somewhere. And some of them probably just became hopeless and said, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. So it's something like that, and I do notice a similar mindset with Gen Z today about like, am I ever going to be able to get a house? Am I ever going to be able to get a job? Is AI going to just take over everything that I learned in my schooling or that I'm learning in school right now? Is school even important? Will I pay these back? This really sounds similar to Gen X. So you guys, and being cynical because you've seen so much on the internet, you're like, look, the world's crazy. We've watched too much true crime. What are we going to do? So they have a somewhat cynical outlook, right? They have a somewhat cynical outlook on the future. They're said to be lazy, have a short attention span, just like Gen Z. They don't simply, here's another thing about Gen X. They didn't want to just simply work to make money. Like boomers were kind of like, oh, it makes money? Awesome. Give me the shovel and let me shovel that horse poo. Yahoo! Money! And I have a house and a car and everything's amazing and my wife has triangle breasts. You get it. You know those bras from the 50s. They made triangle breasts. Everybody loves it. Everybody loved them. So anyway, they didn't want to just work like that. It wasn't enough for Gen X. They wanted to have a passion. They wanted their work to have some kind of meaning. They wanted to feel like they were valuable. They had like philosophical ideas about what work and life was. They even were thinking about how could I design my life and create a more idealized life situation. And I believe just at the tail end of Gen X is Tim Ferriss, who invented the term lifestyle design. So this was the mindset of a Gen Xer. Now, they didn't just want to simply make more money. And not to mention the higher education they did do was more expensive and needed in order to just get a job like we discussed earlier. Even if you wanted a beginner level job, and that was rough. Half of everyone's parents were divorced. No joke. This was like over 40%, like 49% or something. That's what they were saying, like 50% of marriages don't last. This is where that statistic comes from. Those boomers, they were like partying hard. The boomers were adults in the 60s and 70s. Do you know how much they were slanging it? Can you even comprehend how much the boomer parents were slanging it? If you're a Gen Z or if you're a Gen X or a Gen Y, your parents were slanging it. They were cheating on everybody with everybody, going to orgies. They were going crazy. You can picture it in your head right now if you want. Sorry if that's what happened, but it's what happened. They were going crazy. So they got divorced. When you're slanging it in all directions and getting hammered all the time, boomers love to get hammered. They could be like old adults and getting hammered. I don't get it. Anyway, they like to have fun. So they would get divorced because that causes problems, and problems cause divorce, and divorces would happen. And now half of the Gen X people's families were divorced. So it's pretty rough. It's pretty rough, right? So this is an unstable, broken household. Gave them a sense of instability. Give them a sense of a lack of belonging. Like, is this my fault? My parents, they don't belong anywhere. I don't have a place. It shook their trust in institutions like marriage and like the government. So all the other institutions might be fake, right? If this lifelong oath we take for marriage is just not a real thing, what else isn't a real thing? And Gen Xers were very, very cynical about that stuff, and for good reason. They were also a generation that grew up with lead in a lot of things. The numb and dumb idea that we were talking about? Well, they had like a lot of lead paint was getting used in the 60s and 70s, and it was starting to get phased out in the 80s. So during their childhoods, they had lead paint. There was lead gasoline. So like a lot of gas that was going into the air from the exhaust of cars had lead gas in it. So they were breathing lead. Pretty cool, right? Yeah, so some of them, numb and dumb is legit. Like, it's legit for some of them. It's not everybody. Not everybody. But it is what it is. So that's somewhat of the Gen X situation. This stuff all might have affected their mental state. And let's get to the 90s. What was going on in the 90s besides the lead paint, besides all those negatives? Well, in the 90s, there was a massive rise in the self-improvement movement, right? So very similar, I think, to the motivational influencer during current crisis times. Like when there's an economic downturn, it's like, don't worry, I've got your answers for you. Like, there are just three weird things that you can do to make your business fly. I make $20,000 a month doing it. That's the influencer, right? But it was the same thing back in the 90s. They had this like self-help stuff, like, you can do it if you think you can do it, man. That's all it is. You just need to believe. And to some degree, that's true, of course. If you don't believe in it, who's going to believe in it? But not the point. This happens in crisis times, and it was a big rise in self-improvement. All of these environmental factors led to a feeling of being disaffected with modern society and feeling the need to escape or at least lash out. Be cynical, make a quip, make a joke, make some sort of sarcastic remark. That was definitely the way Gen Xers chose to go about things. And the 90s generation just spent a lot of time introspecting. Introspection on the state of the world, on the state of themselves, on the state of their lives, on their own minds. They were thinking about this stuff. So self-improvement definitely kicked in for some of those reasons too. And Gen Xers were very mindful about everything. Maybe too much. Insufferably, some would say. One of the largest environmental factors that molded the mindsets and habits of 90s generations were shaped through, of course, mainstream media. Remember, there was no internet. Without any internet, there was basically only mainstream media, right? And then very seriously underground content. Like you have to find it live, or maybe it's on a public access station at 3 a.m. somewhere. It's underground. You are not finding this on channels. There's just TV channels and that's it. So, everyone's seeing the same stuff. And by 1991, Gen X had consumed twice as much TV as the baby boomers. That's something we talked about. So what does this mean? You can see how much 90s kids care about their media, right? How much do we care about our TV shows? It's crazy. Like the documentaries that exist today, go on Netflix and you're going to find the TV shows that made us, the toys that made us, the video games that made us. You know what I'm saying? All of that is just entertainment. But to 90s kids, it was their world. It was their world. They're like latchkey kids. They come home, everyone's at work, mom, dad, whatever. People are divorced, nobody's home. You unlock the door yourself. You make yourself some kind of grilled cheese sandwich or something. Something basic that can be made, some kind of junk or a microwaved thing. And you watch TV. You sit in front of the TV and you watch what the world is giving you. This is just mainstream media. But so for 90s kids, TV was a big deal. But imagine that made us. With all the instability in the world coming from a broken home, entertainment was the stable factor. The toys, the games, and the shows, they all played at the same time. There was a TV guide that told you what time of day and what day and channel. There's a book that you got in the mail, like with the phone book, that told you what TV shows were going to be on what channel and when. And they were there every week until the show was over. Sometimes it got moved to another night and there'd be like 1,000 commercials that say, the Full House is being moved to 8 o'clock Saturday night, and that's it. Like you'd need to actually change your whole schedule to see the show you wanted to see. So this is crazy stuff. There VCRs, like with VHS tapes, you could tape a show that was on at a particular time, and you supposedly could set your VCR to record it if you left it on that channel and the VCR would start recording. Look, I don't know. Maybe that worked. I don't know a single person that worked for in the 90s. I think that system was a feature that never worked, but they sold it that way anyway. So I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, so here's the thing. The toys, the games, the shows, same time, same day, week in, week out. And I'm going to say none of those things made anyone. That's a bit much. TV shows that made us, come on. It was our parents having the steamy, getting busy session, slanging it. Our parents slanging, those boomers I told you about, slanging it hard with each other, shooting ropes. That made us. But the 90s kids did believe the media was their sensei. It was their Sherpa. It was their rabbi. The media was it. So take that how you will. Look at the culture they created around these things as adults. Just look at the culture, like with toys. Having toys as an adult, as a boomer, was like, what are you talking about? It's ridiculous. I'm not 5 years old, right? Everything you're meant to let go of in your childhood is being clung to, like Rose on the door of the Titanic, right? The way she kicked Leonardo DiCaprio, she stepped on his face and pushed him down into the ice water to drown. The highest grossing film. Everyone loved it. This is how they cling to their toys and the games and the nostalgia of the past. Gen Xers definitely are the most nostalgic. Then it's the millennials. And then I don't know if Zoomers care about anything. Who knows? They probably don't. They probably don't. They don't. It's just anime. It's just anime. So, yeah. Now, although they were called lazy and they were called dumb by the media constantly, Gen Xers were paving their own way in nearly every industry and creating their own counterculture. They were an environmentally conscious generation, They were going, hey, we got to help the environment. And they were the ones who were like, in 10 years, the whole world's going to blow up. And it's been 30 years, but it hasn't. But still, in 10 years, if we don't do something, man, the world's going to blow up. So they cared about keeping the trees and doing all this stuff. And we probably wouldn't have half the stuff we would if not for the Gen Xers being all, vegan-y sanctimonious about environment. So, thanks to that, we do need some of those trees, And their counterculture, though, was a bit of an oxymoron, to be fair. You know what I mean? It was, to be fair, because they're like this environmentally conscious generation, but also did have some layovers from the hippie movement and all the anti-establishment stuff. They looked down on stuff like bands selling out. You were indie, man, and now you're selling out to the man, dude. What's going on, dude? And like, if they signed to a major label, they were like, I liked them when they were in the basement and everything, and they sucked. But now that they're polished, awesome produced band that sounds better than ever, and they have a hit album that everyone in the world likes, they suck. I don't like them. They sold out, man. But Gen X bought tons of luxury goods. They're Apple users. Like, they would be loyal to brands like Apple, the traditionally most expensive computer-based stuff is Apple, and they would spend all the money on that. So, like, they're a bit hypocritical. They're a bit hypocritical, but hey, look, who's not hypocritical? Show me a generation that doesn't have some lofty ideal that they let fall. Like, then I'll look to them and say, hey, they're the best. They're the best. But for now, Gen X, they at least cared a little bit about the environment, and also not at all when it came to buying Apple products. So they were cool with some major corporations, but not others, seemingly at random. It's just, I guess, if the marketing worked well for their particular vibe. And I think we can all relate to that, cheering for the underdog, but actually paying the big dog. It's kind of how it works. That sucks. That sucks. But hey, what are you going to do? Look, we'll figure it out one day. It's been like 100,000 years we haven't, but we'll figure it out. It's going to work out, guys. Don't worry. Optimistic. I'm not a Gen Xer. I'm optimistic. So there were a group of Gen Xers that dressed and literally acted like hippies, though. Speaking of this, just on an aside, like, they were like, I'm going to have dreadlocks. We're smoking weed all day. And we love 60s music, and that's all we listen to. And we're hippies. And we care about the environment, kind of, but we still buy Apple products, but whatever. So yeah, they're believing it was a better time than the 90s. So if you're a Zoomer now going, oh, the 90s would have been so dope. These kids in the 90s were going, oh, the 60s would have been so dope. I ranted and raved because I wanted to go to Woodstock in 1999 because I thought Woodstock in 69 was it. It was it. You know what I mean? So we kind of all feel that way. Or a good portion of people feel that maybe we missed something in the other. We have FOMO for the other decade. Let's put it that way. So they wanted to reclaim some of that feeling from the 60s, and they were acting like hippies and stuff. And there were others who wanted nothing to do with it. There were others who wanted absolutely nothing to do with this old stuff. They believed that they needed to head towards the future. The only thing to do was that. Their thought was that it was difficult to develop your own voice if you're constantly bombarded by voices from the past. You can't be here in the present, and you can't build a future if you're constantly bombarded by some older idea that's past its time. Not that it was bad, or not that they shouldn't believe in some of those values, or not that some of those values are not good, because they are. They are good. It worked. But maybe there's some tweaking that needs to happen in the present moment, because the present is slightly different than the past. And I thought that was a pretty enlightened attitude. Maybe, again, a bit too cynical about the past, like the past must suck in order for that to be the case. Not that anyone said that, but I did get that impression. They were pretty snarky about the past and judgmental. Gen X was known to be a very judgmental generation. And like, my parents don't understand me, man. All these normies don't understand me, man. That was definitely a Gen X thing. I'm kind of just going off on a rant. I hope this isn't too boring for you guys, but that's what I was thinking too. So if you're bombarded with voices from the past, it's going to be tough. to build a future. You know, a lot of Gen Xers also became nihilists in that regard. Like, we don't need to believe anything from the past. It's all 100% wrong. We need to start fresh from right now and know that the world is chaos and that's it. So the nihilist movement blew up with Gen Xers. You know, they believed there was no point, no future. They were on a road to nowhere. This is likely where the slacker or numb and dumb tag came from, because that was kind of like, you're doing nothing. A nihilist oftentimes ends up doing nothing productive and only complaining. And you're just tired of that. You get tired of that stuff real quick. So yeah, anybody now who relates to that in this generation, you might want to rethink it, because that was the legacy of a Gen Xer, denying everything, saying no to everything, and nothing is good and everything is wrong, and they're the only one who's smart enough to know it. Yikes. Oh, yikes. So, okay. You know, at the same time, I'm throwing them under the bus, but there were real world problems and issues with the 9-to-5 dead end job paradigm where you're going to retire when you're 65. Like, that was gone and wasn't going to happen for the Gen Xers, really. You know, free thinking people struggle with that to this day. Oh, how about I go there because the company will do well? I won't, but the company will do well, and I'll spend my whole life, my youth and everything. Won't that be good? Maybe some kids can get into debt later. That doesn't sound great. So there's got to be a better story for that. And everybody struggles with that. Everybody. But Gen X were some of the first to really start dissecting that and saying, yeah, this isn't it. You know, on this downside, though, of this kind of attitude, it could lead to some Gen Xers having super judgmental attitudes. That's what we were talking about. Tendency to speak up about the perceived flaws of others all the time, giving them a kind of ignorant, holier-than-thou reputation. And that's not the best thing in the world. You know, a movie that everyone, I mentioned it earlier, a movie that everyone thinks of as Gen X is Reality Bites. It was starring Ethan Hawke, Ben Stiller, and Winona Ryder. It was directed by Ben Stiller. You know, Zoolander. It was directed by Zoolander. And Reality Bites was bites, the word bites, if you don't know, is an old phrase that meant sucks. It's like, oh, that bites, man. So, I guess in the 90s, people said bites. It died off. There you go. I remember that. That bites. That bites hard. Right? Somebody back me up, right? In the comments. Did you ever say bites? If you said bites, tell me. You did it. I think I said it. I might have been 10 years old at best. 5. That bites, man. Yeah. So the characters in this film, Reality Bites, are the perfect representation of Gen X people. And don't listen to Janeane Garofalo. Don't listen to that. Okay, especially the David Letterman interview with Janeane Garofalo. She's one of the characters in this movie. She came on David Letterman to promote her movie, of course. And she claims the film, it's not Gen X. It's not Gen X, okay? They're trying to market it as Gen X, while being the most Gen X person in the world. She complains in the interview about normies. She tells a bunch of awkward jokes that are trying to be pseudo-intellectual, about how blasé and boring her family is. They just don't understand her, right? They just don't get who she is. Like, oh my God, she's so evolved and everything, right? She took that psych class for that one semester, and it's like over, okay? She haggles over the pronunciation of the word misanthrope. She's like, or misanthrope or misanthrope or misanthrope. I don't know how to say it, She's like she's virtue signaling her intellectualism, and it's so gross. It's so gross. It sounds like I hate Gen Xers. Gen Xers, I love you, by the way. This is just you just need to look at yourselves. You just need to look at yourselves a little bit here, okay? She gives the impression that selling out is bad, while of course being on a prime time late night talk show, the most popular one, right, to promote her movie that is a Gen X movie, and says this Gen X film is not a Gen X film. It is the most Gen X film ever made. She is the Gen X stereotype, all in a 5-minute interview. So watch it if you want. Look for David Letterman, Janeane Garofalo. And it's a bit cringe, but I watched it to research this, and I was like, wow, she is so Gen X. She's wearing a choker, by the way. She's wearing a choker. You can copy her style if you'd like. It was a very 90s style. I mean, she's an actor, though. That doesn't represent every Gen Xer, but still, oh my God. You know, not every Gen Xer was this way, caveat. I hate having to say that. I'm like a Gen Xer now, just being super judgmental. Dude, why do I even have to say this? Trigger warning, not everybody was like that. It was simply the archetype that the media clung to, though. This type of person was like, this is who all Gen Xers were. And it was the mannerisms that were the most obvious. They were easy to remember. It was the mindsets that were the most easy to cling to and remember. So in the end, if I'm to wrap this up, to talk about Gen X, I found that Gen X and many other generations, including Gen Z, the current generation that's coming up, they have a lot in common. They have a lot in common. I don't feel like this is any different. They don't quite connect with their parents as much as you'd hope. They believe they're completely different. And look, we grew up with the internet all the time, so we have the real knowledge now, and we are going to teach you how it is. And to some degree, that's true. Young people teach older people, but older people also teach younger people. And a lot of them going, man, the 90s were awesome. Oh, I want to see all this 90s stuff. Everything's remade. It was all remade from the 80s. Now everything from the 90s is getting rehashed. Easier for the studios to make money that way. So good for you, studios. Make some cash. Send a little my way if you'd like. Send a little my way. I'll talk trash about one of your movies, and you can pay me to do that. No, I don't know. That's very cynical, right? Am I Gen X? Am I Gen Z? Am I a Zennial? Oh my God. I don't want any of these labels. I hate it all. But look, they have a lot in common. All generations have a lot in common, but I felt Gen X and Gen Z, specifically with their jaded nature, liking drama, liking Gen X mostly watch drama. Gen Z mostly watches true crime, which is the most drama possible. So I feel like they're a little similar in that way. And they're just trying to find their way in an ever-changing world where the system gets more and more complex by the day. They're dealing with new technologies and the love and biases of their parents. You know, the things their parents loved, the things their parents are biased about that maybe are not quite aligned to reality, and they're trying to straighten things out. It's the same thing with Gen X and Gen Z. It's the same thing with every generation, really. You know, it's just people trying to figure out who they are, why they're here, and most of all, what to do with their time that they have, you know, like during this period that they live in, which was the 90s for them. It's the 2020s for you. Hey, you know, some chose the past. Some chose the future. And some chose to burn out in the present. I'm thinking Nirvana, Kurt Cobain comes to mind right away. And some other people I know. I just thought of some who are not here. So all you Gen Xers who I remember fondly, who are not here, you know, Godspeed to you. But all of that to say, I think that's the basic taste and smell of the people who were young adults in the 1990s, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. Okay? This is just the tip of the iceberg. This was kind of more of a rant session. I'll get into more specific stuff because we have not touched on the music. You know, Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder, Chris Cornell with their bands, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. We haven't discussed any of the TV shows. We haven't discussed the movies. We haven't discussed the grunge bands and the clothes, and we haven't discussed any of the epic people and places that existed in the 90s that made the thing a really wild, unhinged experience. We haven't discussed Woodstock 99, and I was there, so I could really talk about that. And we will. If you liked this and want to see some more about the 90s, please just tell me. We will do it. I will talk to you later. Goodbye. Ciao, ciao.